Chairman. I have some concerns with the proposed amendment, but before I deal with those, can I just take a couple of seconds to congratulate the Minister, Mr Wyatt, on what I think is a magnificent job that he is doing in the aged care area. I've seen a lot of aged care ministers over my time here, and some of them have been very good, some of them ordinary. But Ken Wyatt, Mr Wyatt, has really demonstrated an understanding of aged care, and particularly of the facilities that look after the elderly in our society. And I'm delighted to say that Mr Wyatt particularly understands the need for aged care and the problems associated with looking after the aged in rural and regional Australia. And the amendment that we're dealing with may well be appropriate in the capital cities. I'm not quite sure that it's appropriate in small communities. I have to say, just last week, the Lower Burdekin Home for the Aged Society called to see me. That operates in the town where I live, Ayr, in North Queensland, about 100 km south of Townsville. And it has facilities both in Ayr and the twin town of Home Hill across the Burdekin River. I know the facility quite well. More than 40 years ago, I was a member of the Apex Service Club when we were invited to a meeting to set up a community aged care facility in the Lower Burdekin. That's Ayr and Home Hill. And my club sent someone along. I still remember promising the person we went, I was president of the club at the time, I said, "Can you go along to this meeting? It's only one meeting. It won't take you very long. You can go along and hear what's being proposed." Turned out that he then became the chairman of the society for about 20 years and did a wonderful job there. But this was a community aged care facility built at the time, as I recall, and which was confirmed to me just last week, built entirely by donations from the community. No government assistance back in those days. Obviously, the daily payment, the inmates, the patients, the people cared for do make a contribution, and the government contributes to them. But after almost 40 years of operating on the basis of community support, the home is now finding that it's having some difficulty in continuing to operate. And they're applying for a capital grant, the first time, I might say, they've ever done this in the 40 years that they've been operating. And their issue is that the home now is between 40, 30, 20 years old as they built extensions. But a lot of the accommodation was appropriate 40 years ago, but not quite so acceptable today. And of course, with the change that we've seen in aged care over the time, where nowadays what used to be low care patients are now being encouraged to stay in their own homes. And the government's providing very, very considerable support to people who want to live in their own homes, but really can't look after themselves in their own homes, but they're getting support coming in. And I've had experience of this. My brother-in-law is now a recipient of that. I know the aged persons' homes in my home community. My mother was there 20, 30 years ago. My mother-in-law was there. My sister was there relatively recently. I've seen what happens. And why I'm concerned about the amendment is that what might work in a unionised workforce in Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra may not work in country areas. I know the Lower Burdekin Home for the Aged is, I think, the second biggest employer in my community. It's a country town. I say a small country town, but by Australian standard it's a country town of about 10,000, 12,000 people. The district's about 20,000 people, so it's a big, small country town. and it's one of the big employers there. And a relative of my wife actually works there, and she provides care and does that as not a professional, but as one who helps in the various things that need to be done. And the important issue for community-run, particularly community-run facilities, is that they are able to balance the books and make things pay. And it sometimes means that the staff have to be multi-skilled. They have to be prepared to enhance the productivity to make sure that the home keeps operating. Because if the home is experiencing some difficulties, it means that for the first time in 40 years it might have to be taken over by one of the corporate aged care places who appropriately, I guess, run these things for profit. Otherwise, often, why would they be involved? But this is a community that is local. It's done by local money, local people. It's part of the community. So I'm concerned about ratios and particular descriptions of prescriptions, I should say, of staffing ratios, because whilst they may be appropriate in one area, they may not have been in the other area. And I think Senator Seward was averting to the same thing in her, might I say, mild support for the amendments. Mr Chairman, I don't want to delay the Senate too long, except to say that there are a number of these community-run aged care facilities in the north of Queensland where I basically operate. I give a shout-out to the Bowen aged care operations on the situated around the community of Bowen, which is an hour south of Ayr, where I live, which is 2 hours south of Townsville. They have a wonderful reputation, and they've done enormously significant work for their local community, and they've operated the books very well, and I'm hopeful that the government will be able to support them in some of the very significant capital works they're undertaking. I mentioned also the Innisfail Maroona aged care facility in Innisfail, a bit north of Townsville, who've done a wonderful job and who were the recipients of some significant Commonwealth grant money in the last round, and they are able to put in place a whole new facility that will be very significant in the community of Innisfail. It's about the same sort of size and atmospherics as the community I live in. It's a sugar town. It's in North Queensland, about 4 hours north of Townsville, about 20,000 people in the surrounding areas. But they do a wonderful job, and it enables long-term residents of those areas, and I say Innisfail, Ingham, Ayr, Home Hill, Bowen, and really every community facility. It allows people who in the past times might have had to leave the place where they've lived all their life and go to one of the capital cities to get good aged care. Now this all happens in these towns that I've mentioned. And the significant thing about all the towns I've mentioned, Mr Chairman, is that they are community-run facilities. Community-run facilities, I don't know, but my guess would be that the union has very little influence there, which means that people are paid well, but they work harder, they work that extra mile where it needs to be, and that's what a community facility is about. And I'd hate to see this approach in these smaller country towns, and I mentioned some towns in North Queensland that I'm aware of, but I'm sure a similar situation applies in many, many, many parts of Australia. And so we have to take this into account, and I'm delighted that Mr Wyatt understands the importance of aged care in remote communities. I go even remoter than the towns I've mentioned, talk about Hughenden and Richmond, west of town, so much smaller towns. But even there, the local councils are doing their own bit for aged care and getting assistance from the Commonwealth Government. And I look forward to having Mr Wyatt come north again, as he indicated he would do when he was up in the north about 6 or 8 months ago. And he does a wonderful job, but he is caring, he understands the issue, and whilst of course he doesn't have a bottomless pocket of money, but he does understand that all parts of Australia need to be looked after, and I'm delighted that he does that wonderful job. On the amendment before the Chair, I have my concerns for the reasons I've mentioned, and for that reason I probably wouldn't be supporting it at this time.